Hello everyone. Welcome to Classical Archaeology, Unit 1, an Introduction. In this video, we will briefly define archaeology, both as an academic discipline, and we'll discuss how the general public views archaeology. After that, we'll discuss what ancient cities are and why they're so important to archaeologists. After that, we're going to discuss some basic archaeological terminology that you're going to come across in this course, including dating methods. Finally, we're going to discuss periodization, how archaeologists classify their finds and put them into specific periods. Archaeology came into its own as an academic field in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Originally, archaeology was the description and study of objects, monuments, works of art, etc., from the ancient past. It was also the study of the collective artifacts, burials, structures, and other material remains of a particular people in the past, locality, period, etc., recovered through excavation and the study of archaeological remains. Archaeology as a field has evolved significantly since its founding over 100 years ago. Nowadays, archaeology is the study of past peoples, societies, and cultures through the systematic excavation, recording, and analysis of artifacts, burials, structures, and other material remains. In other words, the study of past peoples is at the center of the field, rather than the artifacts themselves, as was the case over 100 years ago, and during the early 20th century, as revealed by many films and other types of media that depict the field of archaeology. Popular culture and the general public often have a very different view of archaeology than the one held by professional archaeologists. Popular culture generally has a very romanticized view of archaeology. Popular culture often depicts archaeology as being about artifact collecting for the sake of collection, rather than artifact collecting for the sake of learning more about ancient civilizations. In addition, popular culture often assigns supernatural powers to artifacts. Lastly, popular culture, especially in film, likes to depict archaeologists in the past rather than the present. Eras like the 1920s and 1930s are especially popular. The field of archaeology was somewhat less professionalized in the 1920s and 1930s, although archaeology, even 100 years ago, was far more academic and far more professional than these films would like to suggest. In reality, archaeology is often a very slow, methodical, even painstaking process. Archaeologists carefully use hand tools like brushes and sieves to sift through layers of earth or strata. Then they carefully divide their sites into grids to help them keep track of the artifacts they unearth. In the past, difficulties have often arisen over ownership of artifacts that have been uncovered. In recent years, they generally do not rise to the level of acrimony seen in media like the fictional Indiana Jones films, in which the protagonist fights for artifacts against people like the Nazis, for example. In the past, archaeologists often fought over ownership of artifacts they found with local governments, but it rarely escalated to the level we see in films. Archaeology is an interdisciplinary academic field. It borrows perspectives, theory, and methodology from a variety of other academic disciplines. Some academic disciplines that archaeology borrows perspectives from include anthropology, chemistry, ethnography, folklore studies, history, philology, too many others to list. Archaeology and archaeologists use a variety of sources, including both artifacts and written texts stored in libraries and archives, to explore the past. Archaeologists analyze the artifacts they have unearthed in laboratories, where they identify them, reconstruct them, determine their ownership and original use, and, if necessary, preserve them. Archaeologists use artifacts, also known as material objects or material culture, to answer questions about past civilizations that are left unanswered by written sources. In this course, we'll take a broad, holistic perspective on artifacts / material culture / material objects. Material objects that are useful to archaeologists can be small, like a potsherd, or large, like a building. Material culture and material objects can often bridge the gap between artifacts and material sources. For example, potsherds, material objects, often had written inscriptions, being used by ancient people as a material for writing down notes, similar to how people scribble notes in shopping lists on scrap pieces of paper today. Natural materials, like seeds, animal bones, and even human remains, will also be considered material culture in this course. All of these material sources, though different from each other, are useful and can help archaeologists learn about the past in ways that are impossible using only written sources. This course will consider the nature of classical civilizations by discussing their urban centers, their cities. Archaeologists like to focus on cities because urban sites will offer more artifacts for them to discover due to their higher human population density in the past. Because of their higher population density, cities are often the primary driver of a civilization's cultural output, and they can be a macrocosm of that civilization's culture and society. Studying cities in the past can also help us answer questions about cities in the present. Once again, highlighting the interdisciplinary nature of archaeology as a field. Before continuing on, we should briefly define what a city is. The modern English word city comes from the Latin term civitas for community, although the ancient Romans, who developed the Latin language, would have used the term urbs to describe city. Urbs is the root of our English word urban. Archaeologist Gordon Childe identified 10 characteristics of cities in 1950. See page 3 of the course textbook for these 10 terms. To sum up Childe's terminology, basically, a city is a large permanent settlement that has enough residents to possess a division of labor, store resources, and develop and export a culture to surrounding localities. What kind of sources do archaeologists use to study ancient cities? Well, they can consider the buildings of ancient cities. Some buildings from ancient cities are still in use, like the Pantheon in Rome. They can also use buildings that are no longer being used in their intended manner, like the Great Pyramid of Giza, which was once a tomb, but is now a historical / tourist site. Archaeologists also can use smaller artifacts recovered from ruins / excavation sites. These smaller artifacts can be things that the inhabitants of ancient cities want to preserve, like artwork, or it can be items that were used in their daily life that were not meant to be preserved, like pot shards, animal bones, broken tools, and much more. Additionally, archaeologists can use ethnography to learn about ancient cities. They can study present-day people who are descendants of the residents of the ancient city/culture that they are trying to recreate. Ethnography, though, can be inaccurate due to things like the migrations of people, changing trade networks, and because progress is not strictly linear. Now that we've discussed what archaeology is as a field and what sources archaeologists use, we can now go over some archaeological terminology. We'll start with dating methods. There are two major dating methods that archaeologists use to establish chronologies of the artifacts they find. These are relative dating and absolute dating. Relative dating says artifact X is older than artifact Y. Absolute dating says artifact X is this many years old. Both dating methods are useful, but both dating methods have their limitations. As such, archaeologists use both relative and absolute dating to establish chronologies for the artifacts they discover. One of the most important forms of relative dating that archaeologists use is called seriation. Seriation notes differences between groups of artifacts, for example, automobiles. Seriation has some core assumptions, namely that more sophisticated artifacts will be newer as craftspeople become more skilled in their techniques over time. As such, there are some limits to seriation. Declining civilizations, for example, being short on resources and facing external and internal threats, will often produce less sophisticated objects than their predecessors. Additionally, archaeologists might misclassify two different types of artifacts that were used for very different purposes. For example, an archaeologist might mistakenly think that a clay lamp is a type of pot because they are both made of clay and have a similar round shape, yet they are used for very different purposes. A lamp is designed to provide light, whereas a clay pot is used for storage. Here are some examples that show the limits of seriation. On the right example, we see two statues of a fertility goddess known as Venus. On the left is the Venus de Milo, which was sculpted around roughly 150 to 125 BCE. Further to the right, we see the Venus of Willendorf, sculpted roughly 23,000 BCE. In this case, seriation works because the more technically sophisticated artifact is much more recent. However, in our left example, we see the artifact that displays a lower level of technical sophistication. The scream was created much more recently than the artifact with a higher level of technical sophistication, the Mona Lisa. By the way, I'm not saying that modern art is bad. I'm just saying that the level of brushstrokes and sophistication on canvas is much simpler, highlighting that seriation does not always prove accurate. Now we'll discuss another relative dating method used by archaeologists called stratigraphy. Stratigraphy considers layers of earth, known as strata. and the artifacts contained in each layer. Stratigraphy assumes that artifacts in higher layers are more recent than those found in lower layers. There are, however, some limitations to stratigraphy. Layers of strata can be disturbed by large-scale natural disasters, like floods or earthquakes. Layers can also be disturbed by human excavation. See the diagram here, how a medieval pit cuts through several different layers of strata, even though the pit was created during one period. Additionally, layers of strata can be very unclear, far more unclear than they are in this diagram. Additionally, layers of strata may be deposited at different rates, which is why stratigraphy is a relative dating method. It helps archaeologists estimate which artifacts are older than others and which artifacts are more recent. Here are a couple of examples that highlight the limitations of stratigraphy, namely how layers of strata are not always chronologically on top of one another, with the newest layers being on top and the oldest layers being at the bottom. Sometimes, as can be seen on the left-hand side of this slide, one layer of strata will cut through multiple other layers, making stratigraphy very difficult to use. Now we'll talk a little bit about absolute dating. With absolute dating, archaeologists can assign dates to the artifacts they find. But as was the case with relative dating, there are limits to the absolute dating methods that archaeologists use. The first absolute dating method we'll discuss is called dendrochronology. Dendrochronology gets its name from the Greek word dendron, meaning tree, and chronology, meaning study of time. Dendrochronology counts tree rings to determine the age of a tree or the age of a wooden artifact where tree rings are evident. Larger rings denote rainier years, in which the trees grew more. There are, of course, some limitations with dendrochronology. Some trees have very long life cycles of centuries, even millennia. Other trees only live for a few years. In addition, artisans in the past may have used a tree that had been dead for centuries to make the objects that archaeologists have discovered. So, when an archaeologist uses dendrochronology to decide the age of a wooden object, they are assuming that the past person who made this object immediately cut down the tree and fashioned the object that the archaeologist found. The second absolute dating method we'll discuss in this course involves archaeologists' use of historical documentary sources. Scholars in ancient times recorded historical events that were of significance and dated them using repeatable astronomical observations, such as the passing of a comet or the position of a star or planet in the night sky. Here are a few notable historical chronologies that are used by archaeologists. They include Manetho's Egyptian dynastic chronology from the 3rd century BCE, the Babylonian and Hebrew biblical chronologies, and then the Julian/Gregorian calendar, which gave us the BC and CE dating systems, which are still in use. Archaeologists will use multiple chronologies together to assign dates to historical events and to date the material objects they find. There are, of course, some limitations with using these ancient documentary sources. Ancient authors were not always precise in their astronomical observations. They didn't say where they were when they observed the star Sirius in the night sky, for example. In addition, not all chronologies were meant to be taken literally. The third absolute dating method we'll discuss in this course is atomic radiocarbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 dating was developed after the Second World War by Willard Libby of the University of Chicago. Carbon-14 dating works by measuring how long it takes for carbon-14 isotopes to lose their extra neutrons to become regular carbon-12, as you can see in the atomic model on the left-hand side of this slide. Carbon atoms gain extra neutrons from solar radiation. Like the other relative and absolute dating methods discussed in this video, carbon-14 dating has its limitations. When used correctly, carbon-14 dating can be fairly accurate, but it is not always precise. As precision increases, the chance of accuracy decreases when using carbon dating. Additionally, carbon-14 dating can only be used on artifacts that contain large amounts of carbon, primarily natural materials like bones or wood, although carbon-14 could theoretically be used on an item made of high-carbon steel. Carbon-14 dating is also unreliable when used on living objects, like live trees, as a living thing will replenish its cells and regrow its cells and take on additional carbon-14. Carbon-14 dating can also only be used on objects that are less than 50,000 years old, and the method becomes increasingly unreliable on artifacts that are more than 37,000 years old. Carbon-14 dating also assumes that the decay or breakdown of carbon-14 has occurred at a constant rate throughout time. Lastly, carbon-14 dating assumes that the depositing of carbon-14 from solar radiation has been relatively constant throughout Earth's history. Scholars argue that at certain points in human history, solar radiation was higher, meaning theoretically that the deposit of carbon-14 was higher at certain points in Earth's history. This would make some objects seem to be far more recent than they actually are. Because of the limitations endemic to each of the aforementioned relative and absolute dating methods, good archaeologists will use a combination of these chronological techniques to date their finds. Archaeologists will also use terms like circa, from the Latin word circum, meaning ring or roundabout, to indicate that their dates are estimates. Additionally, archaeologists will revise their work in light of new discoveries. In addition to dating artifacts through absolute and relative methods, archaeologists will organize their finds by periods. Some of the periods that we will use in this course include the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, along with periods like the Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic periods for ancient Greece, and then the Republican and Imperial periods for ancient Rome. Just like the dating methods we discussed previously, periodization has its limitations as well. There are limits when using technology-based periodization, like the Bronze Age or the Neolithic Age. Not all cultures adopt a technology at the same time, and some cultures do not adopt a technology at all. For example, The Bronze Age occurred from roughly 3300 to 3000 BCE, varying by region and civilization. And not all civilizations used bronze tools. Some civilizations went from the Stone Age right into the Iron Age. There are also issues with culture-based periods. Culture-based periodization is teleological. These periods were set up by archaeologists for the purpose of categorizing archaeological finds. The people of the past who would have lived in these periods would not have classified their civilizations in the same way. For example, ancient Greeks living during the Archaic period from about 800 to 480 BCE would not have referred to themselves as the Archaic Greeks. They would have said, what makes them archaic? They are the Greeks of the present. Keep in mind that they probably would not have referred to themselves as Greeks, but rather by the city-state they were living in, Athenians, Spartans, etc. On the right-hand side of this slide, we can see an example of the limitations of periodization. The top image is of two bronze swords from the ancient Mediterranean, from about the 17th century BCE. The bottom image is of a bronze sword from China, from about the 6th to the 5th century BCE. These are both bronze swords, but they were made over 1,000 years apart. So saying that they are both Bronze Age, while correct, is not very helpful. Before we wrap up this video, we'll discuss the standardized dates and measurements used by archaeologists. Archaeologists generally measure time using 365.25 day years, with the designations of BC, before Christ, or AD, Anno Domini, Latin for Year of Our Lord, or after the birth of Christ. The dates do not add up perfectly because a year is slightly longer than 365 days. This is why we have leap years, and why Jesus Christ was born circa 3 to 5 BC, before Christ. Many scholars use BCE, before Common Era, and CE, Common Era, to be more inclusive. Students in this course may use whatever dating terminology they wish. Just be consistent. Do not switch between BC and BC or CE and AD. When it comes to measurements, students may use the metric system, meter, liter, and gram, or the English/imperial system, feet, pound, miles, etc. Just be consistent. To wrap things up, at present, archaeology is an academic discipline that answers questions about past civilizations, primarily through the analysis of the artifacts that they have left behind, also known as material culture. Archaeology has evolved significantly over the last century, as archaeologists have redefined the goal of the field, and they have also evolved the field's perspectives on the ownership of artifacts. Throughout this course, we'll discuss the ownership of artifacts. Archaeology is an interdisciplinary field, drawing perspectives from a variety of other academic subjects. Ancient urban sites, cities, are of particular interest to archaeologists, as they present a microcosm of the civilizations they are studying. Archaeologists use a variety of dating methods, both relative and absolute, to chronologically arrange and date their finds. Good archaeologists also recognize that all dating methods, both relative and absolute, have their limitations. As such, archaeologists will use as many dating methods as possible when they create their chronologies. Archaeologists also work to make their periodization and terminology as standardized as possible, to prevent confusion and to make their discoveries accessible to other scholars as well as the general public. But as is the case with dating methods, periodization has its limitations as well. We will use this definition of archaeology and this terminology throughout our course.